Quick question. Do your end users always, and I mean always, without exception, work on company owned devices and IT approved apps? I didn't think so. So, how do you keep your company's data safe when it's sitting on all those unmanaged apps and devices? 1Password has an answer to this question: Extended Access Management. 1Password Extended Access Management helps you secure every sign in for every app on every device because it solves the problems traditional IAM and MDM can't touch. Check it out at onepassword.com/XAM. That's onepassword.com/XAM.
All right, everybody. I'm Jonna Till Johnson, CEO of Nemertes. I'm here with my co-host,
John Burke, CTO of Nemertes.
and you are listening to Guess What? Heavy Strategy, the show that tries to ask the right questions, not give the right answers. Before we kick off today, thank you very much. We did get some follow-up. Someone wrote in last week, actually 2 weeks ago, on the latest Heavy Strategy. You commented that a lot of IT people are basically caregivers of a sort. That sounded surprising to you, but if you think about it, we're solvers. We like solving things. We like building things. IT just gives us a large toolbox. Okay, so the tools were built by IT people who said, okay, this tool gets incredibly hot when you use it, but here's the MVP for now. But in the end, we make things. 100 years ago, it would be mechanical engineering or chemical engineering. Gee, that's a dangerous thought. Dr. Chuck Jekyll, this is safe to drink, right? It's the minimum viable potion. Should be okay, but it's the same idea. Yes, but no. I am an engineer like most folks that are listening to this, and I love to solve problems. I think solving problems is fantastic. I am not particularly motivated by helping people, other than if they present me with interesting problems. I'm not one of those people that gets up in the morning and says, how can I make the world a better place by feeding the hungry? I do some of those things. I'm not a horrible person, but what excites me is, ooh, you have a hard problem. Let me tackle that, which is not quite the same thing as being a caregiver. And that's the distinction that I was kind of hitting on there. I think IT people are more caring and more loving and more nurturing than anyone gives us credit for, because people like me don't deserve that credit, but other people do. John, what do you think?
I will help people solve boring problems too.
You will help people do anything because your payoff is when that person says, "Oh, I'm so happy now. Thank you," because you know you made the world a better place.
IT is a great place to do that.
It is indeed. All right. So for today, you wanted to talk about when do you stop throwing good money out of bad, and how do you get out of the sunk costs fallacy? And John, you were explaining this, this topic, which is never, no, always, no, never, change horses in midstream. It kind of fell out of the conversation we were having a couple of weeks ago, where we talked about getting out of analysis paralysis. So maybe you can spell out the problem you're trying to solve here, since we know IT is problem solvers.
And in a way, it's like a follow-on, because once you get out of the analysis phase, a lot of times what you step into next is the planning phase. And we've all been in IT projects that plan something to death, try and foresee every possible twist and turn in the path on the way to delivering whatever it is we're delivering at the far end of it, and make a planned response for every possible thing along the way, and carve out our main path and our contingency paths, and have everything run down to the last possible degree of foresight we have to bring to bear.
Okay.
And that can be just as paralyzing as the analysis phase.
So basically, John, your whole point with make a plan and follow the plan until you stop following it is sometimes you follow the plan until it doesn't work anymore, and then you take a detour, you plan a detour, you do something else. How do you know when you just have to push harder to execute your plan, and when it's time to sit down and rethink what your plan is?
When conditions change too much, that's usually a good sign that you need to think about your plan again. Because if you make a plan for, I used to work in universities. If you make a plan for the university that existed when you started, and then along the way your university merges with another one down the street, and now has got twice as many students, twice as many physical locations, and twice as many staff and faculty members, roughly, your plan is probably not viable anymore, and you need to stop and reconsider. And
Okay.
that kind of
So
significant change is possible in any kind of business, any kind of organization.
yeah, so basically, so one answer to the question would be you reconsider your plan when external conditions change. But I think what a lot of us tend to see is that the plan doesn't we can't execute the plan precisely as envisioned. And so the real challenge comes in trying to figure out, okay, the conditions haven't changed, but my plan isn't working perfectly because of all these things I didn't think of or, that popped up. In a scenario like that, when do you think about whether to keep on keeping on or to change the plan?
That's an ongoing consideration. If you're executing a plan, typically that means you're having some kinds of ongoing meetings to see how the plan is going. And as one of our defense contractor research subjects used to say, launch and correct, launch and correct. Um, it's important to have a plan, but to be able to, fire those little thrusters on the side to keep it on target. Uh, so that's an ongoing thing and needs to be a consideration basically every time you're touching base, however often that is, on the execution of the plan. Uh, Ideally, also, everybody should feel qualified and empowered to raise their hand and say, hey, something that's going on here means that what we had planned to do doesn't make the right kind of sense anymore.
Well,
And
and
whether
I want
that's
to push
because of
back on
issues
that.
of
John, I
scale
want to
or
push on
cost or
that a little bit.
applicability, it's all got to be there.
John, I want to push on that a little bit because sometimes it's not so much that it doesn't make sense. It's that every week or every day you have the same meeting. It's like, well, you need to do your thing. Well, I didn't do it. Well, why didn't you do it? Or I did it halfway. Why didn't you do it halfway? And that gets to a point that I really want to raise, which is that's when you have to start asking the 5 whys. The first time or two, or maybe even three, can be somebody just being, human error. Geez, I screwed up. I made a mistake. But if something keeps happening that's a problem, you don't want to just let it slide and say, well, do better next time, do better next time. I forgive you, do better next time. At some point, you have to start asking, why couldn't you do that? And then what was the reason behind that? So, for example, well, I didn't have enough time. Well, that's not really an answer. That just says I wasn't able to prioritize. So let's talk about what you did prioritize and why you did those things. And that's the second why. And then there's the third why. There's the why behind the why behind the why, which may get you to the root cause of what you've actually planned is flat out impossible. And go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to agree. If what you've planned relies on your plan's work being the top priority for everybody involved, and that is not the case, then yep, doomed to
That's
failure.
that's not actually what I'm saying though, John. That's an interesting observation, but it's kind of orthogonal. Because what I'm saying is if the plan nothing's changed externally, but internally you're failing to execute the plan again and again, more than once or twice, regardless of what priority level it is, you need to stop and ask yourself why you're not executing that plan. And it may be a priority issue, it may be something totally different. Oh, we didn't get the resources. Oh, this, oh, that. But again, you have to apply the 5 whys to determine the right answer there. So, another thing I would suggest is another red flag that says it's time to rethink your plan is when you keep trying to execute, but something's holding you back and it's holding you back repetitively. Because if
Sure.
that's happening, then you have to apply the 5 whys to figure out why that's holding you back. So those are two scenarios in which you might want to reconsider. Are there any others?
Oh, sure. Major, I hate to say quantum leap because quantum is the smallest possible leap, but significant changes in the technological environment can make it not just practical, but ideal to bail out of a plan, stop, and uh, reconsider how you're going to get to whatever your goal is. And AI is probably a reasonable example right now. If what you were planning on doing was, building out a new call center so that you could have, lots of people answering lots of text messages from your customers, and somewhere along the middle of that, Chat GPT style AIs made it eminently possible to do all that in software instead of humans on keyboards, it's a good time to reconsider before you finish building out those new call centers and all the technology associated with them.
Okay, so basically, just to recap, if the environment, your organization has changed, if you're trying and repeatedly failing to execute as you said you wanted to, or if the technology environment has changed, those are all great reasons to stop and reboot your plan instead of pushing harder. Others that come to mind?
Uh, the goal becomes invalid. You're trying to empower some business function. The business function goes away, gets deprioritized, changes direction. And so, like the target you're aiming for is it's not a matter of scale or a matter of breadth. It's a matter of it just stopped being relevant.
Well, and that's an interesting point. And yes, I do agree that if the desired outcome suddenly changes or is irrelevant, I think that's a subset just to be pedantic, that's probably a subset of your organization changing, but it's
Yeah.
an important enough one that stands on its own. That's actually one of the reasons we recommend to clients that they start with business drivers, translate those drivers into technology principles, and then and only then start building out strategies. Not because those business drivers never change or those technology principles never change, but because if they do, that becomes a clear trigger to rethink your strategy, which then you should rethink the strategic plan, which you should rethink your project plan. And
Absolutely.
yeah,
Now,
go ahead.
on the other side, though, I do want to note that having a plan is a great thing for the people involved in executing on the plan because it gives them a clear timeline for the work they're going to need to fit into their days, weeks, months, the knowledge that they're going to have to acquire and potentially become expert in along the way. And um, generally puts them in a good place for being what they need to be at each step of the process of achieving that goal, rolling out that technology, whatever it is. It's also good for your user base if they can point to a timeline and say, we know this is coming and we have time to get training in whatever the new thing is. So we're ready to use it once it lands.
So those are actually two separate points I want to
Yes.
highlight. One is the idea of having a plan that is very clearly linked to a timeline so that you can say by next Tuesday, this module should have been developed and tested. And then communicating that timeline on an ongoing basis to groups and organizations that may need to know this stuff. I think those are both incredibly important. And I think we're coming close to one of the reasons that people don't want to change plans because you feel like you've built up a huge set of expectations around something and the expectations are outside just your friends and family. The client services team may be waiting for that module to be developed. And you don't want to come out and say, you know what, we've changed our mind. We're not doing that module after all. You don't want to let people down. It gets back to the follow up at the very beginning. Our natural caretaking tendency is don't let people down, do what you promised, etc. And I think that's one of the reasons we're having this conversation because sometimes it's better to break a promise or break a commitment, I would say, than it is to keep executing on it if it's no longer the right one for the environment. And I think you've got to have a mechanism in your organization that allows you to do that. So that what I'm talking about is when you sit down with your customers, your internal customers, or whoever needs to hear what you're doing, basically, you always want to tie everything back to the business drivers and technology principles. We are moving this workload to cloud because cloud is one of the technology principles that instantiates our business driver of being super agile. Now, one day, your business driver suddenly changes and security trumps agility, for example. Then you go to everybody and say, look, that workload you all were expecting to be in cloud? Well, it's not going there because we've changed, because the business driver has changed, the technology principle has changed, and therefore we are not doing what we said we would. And To my mind, the important thing here is to be able to tie back your decision to why you made it. And 99 times out of 100, people will listen and go, oh, okay, that makes sense. But most people have just a visceral reaction against making that kind of a statement because, we just don't want to let people down. And that I think is important.
It is. And so it's really important in your communications with folks to be super clear about what is committed, what is going to happen and what is intended, what the ultimate plan and goal is, and that it's not a certainty, right? It's a goal and a target and not a certainty. Whereas, the thing that I'm turning on tomorrow so that everybody can use it, that's pretty much a certainty. um,
Well, yes, but no. I don't think there's a meaningful distinction between intent and certainty because I might not turn that thing on tomorrow if suddenly we discovered it has a huge vulnerability and the
no, a
vulnerability was
good
a
point. Good
third
point.
party vulnerability. I think the important thing is to make it clear why we make decisions we make. Like what I just said is an example of, hey, we're not turning it on because security just trumped productivity as a business driver. It's more important for us to be secure than it is for you to be productive. Sorry. So you're not getting your app because the security impact is too great. People can grumble, but they kind of get it.
Let's pause for a message from today's sponsor, 1Password. Imagine your company's security is like the quad of a college campus. There are nice brick paths between the buildings. Those are the company owned devices, IT approved apps, and managed employee identities. And then there are the paths people actually use, the shortcuts worn through the grass to the actual straightest line from point A to B. Those are the unmanaged devices, shadow IT apps, and non employee identities like contractors. And most security tools only work on those happy brick paths, but lots of security problems take place on the shortcuts. 1Password Extended Access Management is the first security solution that brings all these unmanaged devices, apps, and identities under your control. It ensures that every user credential is strong and protected, every device is known and healthy, and every app is visible. 1Password Extended Access Management solves the problems traditional IAM and MDM can't. It's security for the way we work today, and it's now generally available to companies with Okta and Microsoft Entra, and in beta for Google Workspace customers. Check it out at onepassword.com/XAM. That's onepassword.com/XAM. And now back to the podcast.
And they will grumble. And if history is any guide, eventually you will push that thing out, whether all the security problems have been addressed with it or not, because, that's what your sales folk, that's what your stock
Yes, but
analysts, that's what
no. I
whoever
mean,
needs. No, yes, but yes, we have seen that again and again. And that is
yeah,
why
but
we have the vast dimensions of corporate security
well,
problems that we have, is because we keep pushing things out before they're secure. And we
okay,
do
but
that because
John,
that's what the
John,
users want and
John,
require.
John, John. Two things. One is that was just an example. There are tons of examples where it's a subset of the example of priority A suddenly trumps priority B because things have changed. And the main point here is to make it clear that priority A is trumping priority B, not that priority A is security. That's thing one. Thing two, I would say there's a whole different discussion around security. And one of the things that's changed is the fact that people will actually go to jail now if they're insecure. So predicting the future from the past in this case is possibly a little less viable. So I just didn't want to let your cavalier assertion that, oh, sure, we'll go ahead and deprioritize security anyway, because that's what we've always done, to stand, even though it's a second order concern. The primary point I was making is, as long as you're clear that you're doing things because of priorities and that the priorities have changed for whatever reason, it's easier to make the argument that I am not doing what I said I was going to do than if you fail to explain the connection between the priorities and what you're doing. And that's kind of the big picture point. And then the whole security discussion is a sideshow. But again, it is important to note that as of 2024, people can go to jail for people like CISOs can go to jail for not doing something quote unquote the right way. So I wouldn't be surprised if companies were a lot less cavalier with security going forward.
Yeah, I think you're much more likely to see them fail to fill those positions.
I think that well, not really. I mean,
Oh yeah.
if you want to keep pushing on the security thing, I'm happy to do that. My main recommendation is if there's any of you considering becoming a CISO, make damn sure that you have got a fair amount of money in escrow to cover your costs for supporting your family in case you're sent to jail, in case you're the only person in your company that's sent to jail because you were made the scapegoat, which does in fact happen. So there's a whole conversation on that. And I don't think companies are going to have a hard time filling those positions because they're required to have them filled by SEC mandate and others. And frankly, people will take the jobs if they're, palatable enough. Sure. Are you going to pay me $10 million if I have to go to jail for 60 days? Sign me up. I don't care. I don't mind carrying felon on my record if my
If it
family
means I
can
never get
retire.
to be hired as a CISO again, it'll be a good thing.
It doesn't matter if I have $10 million in my pocket, I don't need to be hired again. I'm good.
Yep. No, it's going to become an arbitrage. You're totally right. It's going to become an arbitrage calculation between how much of my salary can I collect before we have something I can go to jail for happen to us, and
Well,
can I
not no,
bail?
no, no.
Can I bail before that thing happens and leave it for the next guy? I think
Well,
there's going to be a constant calculation for a lot of folks.
yes,
But you're right.
there is that.
This is
Okay, because
somewhat
the
beside the
sideshow.
point, because I
Yeah.
tend to agree with you that it's better to have goals and strategies and principles by which you change those things, and the plans shorter range and more tactical, as opposed to long term and tied to intricate requirements for everything to kind of stay static as far as it's relevant to this particular project. I'm right with you there. And I don't think there's a great history of IT executives getting a lot of traction out of saying, well, our priorities changed, so I shifted resources away from this to that. Uh, I could be wrong, but my experience has been more, well, those aren't the company's priorities anymore, but you still have to get that all done and the new things that have become the priorities. So
Well,
just figure it out.
there you kind of touched on something that's super important and why we're even having this conversation. Honestly, I keep coming back to the fact that a tech strategy needs to be tied back to technology principles that enable business drivers, right?
Right.
And our job as technologists, the thing we and only we can do is to select those technology principles that enable the business drivers. The business drivers are up to the business. But if you continue to tie your entire portfolio of projects back to the business drivers and back to the technology principles, you can have meaningful conversations with the business that go along the lines of, well, which business driver is more important? Agility or productivity? Which business driver is more important? And the answer can't be, although it often is, I know, all of them are equally important and they're all priority one. The pushback has got to be, look, that and it's legitimate for IT to say this. Look, if everything's top priority, nothing's top priority. So of all the top priorities, what is the super top priority? And again, you're not asking them to select an IT project that's a top priority. You're asking them to select a business driver that's top priority. And that gives you the ability to then go back and say, okay, guys, we're doing X instead of Y because you told me on Tuesday, November 19th, that this priority was more important than that priority. If that has changed, I will happily do Y instead of X. Please let me know. And that forces your business managers to have the kind of logical problem solving if then mind that IT people often wish they had.
Well, it can attempt to force them to have that, but
Yes.
whether it succeeds is going to vary widely.
Well, that's true. And I agree. And I think it comes back to what our follow up really was, because the difference between problem solving and caretaking, is important. But part of the challenge is, as IT people, we're either caregivers or problem solvers. But in both cases, we're responding to an external need and we don't feel very comfortable telling the business what their need ought to be. And yet, to a certain extent, that's what we're saying you ought to be able to do. You need to go back and say, you need to decide whether X is more important than Y. And what I found is you can't fix broken management. So if there's anybody listening going, that's just not going to work, Jonna, you're right. You can't fix broken management. But what you can do sometimes is to train upwards and to be, lead from the field, so to speak, and gently coax, coerce, drive, focus your management on making the kinds of decisions that you need them to make so that you can do your job to help them.
I'm just wrestling in my mind with whether the corollary to you can't fix broken management is all management is broken. Um, because uh, basically we're a bunch of chimpanzees, and our organizations replicate primate power structures all the time. And, trying to convince the other chimps that they need to prioritize not getting eaten by leopards over not starving to death, not always easy. Um,
Well, I think you're right. But I also think if you're going to say all management is always broken, then there's no point to doing anything, and you might as well collect your paycheck until you're fired. That doesn't make sense to me, and it doesn't align with what I've actually seen out there, which is management is a spectrum from incredibly good and amazing at doing these things like prioritizing and willing to drop lesser priority goals in favor of making greater priority goals happen, all the way down to, pathetic and incompetent. And most folks are somewhere in the middle and can be improved and moved up the scale a little bit with adept management from the IT folks. And I think that's another thing to keep in mind. If you're in an environment where you can't stick to a plan because your management keeps whipsawing you with different priorities and nothing you've tried can get them to focus on it, that's an excellent time to start polishing your resume and contacting a headhunter. Now, what's interesting though, and I will say this, sometimes clients have said senior management just has their head someplace dark and moist and can't solve these problems. Um, and then what happens is one person leaves and suddenly they realize it's not senior management. This one person was the sticking point, and everybody else absolutely knows what needs to get done and is jumping on it. And they just couldn't get rid of that person because they were senior or whatever. So that's something else to think about as well. Is it all senior management is nuts? Is it the corporate culture is just broken? Or are there a handful of individuals that just have to be engineered around because there's no way to fix them?
And
Um,
it's usually possible in environments that are fundamentally broken to still find viable strategies for advancing IT goals within whatever passes for corporate uh, business goal setting. Um, but you have to be very sensitive to the changeable nature of your organization and the fact that it could, on a whim, uh, be asking you to turn on a dime and do something different. So you gotta, if you're making plans, make sure they're short-term plans with simple and clearly defined goals that you can achieve quickly and move on from. It's, I'm not advocating for trying to make DevOps everything, but the idea of having little sprints for deploying things in your organization isn't a terrible one if that's the kind of organization you're stuck with.
I think you've got to, yeah, I agree with the sprints. And every time I write about the sprints, I think we need to do more of that ourselves because there is just a delightful feeling that comes with the delivery of the MVP, not the most viable potion, but the most viable product at the end of the sprint and going, we got that done. And it's nice to be able to say we got that done. But I kind of overall, I think coming back to should you change horses midstream, the answer is it depends. What
Yeah.
has something changed in your environment? Has something changed in your corporate priorities? Are you running into unexpected roadblocks in executing what you thought you could do? Has new technology emerged? All of these things might be a good reason for the answer to be yes. And if you're worried about the impact of making a change on your greater customer base, I think the safest protection is to always tie all of your decisions clearly back to corporate priorities, business drivers, technology principles, and make it clear that when those change, you will change too. What's that Lord Keynes quote? When the facts change, my opinion changes. Why? What does yours do? Right?
Exactly. I think don't change horses in midstream. Keep in mind that that's, you know, a reasonable idea if you can clearly see the other side of the stream and your horse is going to live long enough to make it to the other side. But, if the horse falls out from under you, you've got to have a different kind of a strategy. And if we're going to deploy adage and counter adage, don't throw good money after bad is also a very good way to think about these situations.
All right. So hopefully we gave you some good questions to think about. And with that, thank you again for listening to this episode of Heavy Strategy. Again, if you got feedback or follow-up, as you can see, we love them. Send us a message at packetpushers.net/FU. We love to hear from you. If you want to be on the show, let us know what you want to talk about, why you want to be on the show, why we should pick you. And also at packetpushers.net, you'll find the Network Break podcast, which I and Drew Conry Murray host comes out every Monday, which keeps you current on the latest tech news and what it means. And again, if you want to reach us, please reach out to us at nemertes.com. That's N like Nancy, EM like Mary, ERT like Thomas, ES.com. We look forward to hearing from you.